A secret written in their genes for 1500 years has finally been decoded. For centuries, the samurai have been seen as the purest symbol of Japan, warriors born from an ancient, isolated people, defenders of a culture untouched by the outside world. Their armor, their code of honor, their deadly skill with the blade all seem to rise from a uniquely Japanese past. But DNA is telling a different story. A story of a 300-year mystery, of a third ancestry that appeared suddenly in Japan's ruling class, and of genetic links that stretch far beyond the islands, across the sea, across the continent, and deep into the heart of the Eurasian steppe. The samurai were not simply the descendants of one ancient people. They were shaped by a hidden wave of migrants whose arrival reshaped Japan forever. Long before the first samurai ever drew a sword, Japan was home to a very different world. The earliest known inhabitants of the islands were the Jōmon people, hunter-gatherers who lived in Japan for more than 10,000 years. They fished the coasts, hunted in dense forests, and created some of the world's oldest pottery. Genetically, they were deeply distinct, separated from mainland populations for thousands of years. For millennia, they were Japan. Then, around 2,300 years ago, a second wave arrived. These were the Yayoi migrants, coming through the Korean peninsula. They brought rice farming, metal tools, and new forms of social hierarchy. Their DNA was closer to populations from Korea and eastern China than to the Jōmon. Over centuries, they spread across the islands, mixing with local groups and transforming society. Villages became farming communities. Farming communities became political territories. Power began to concentrate. Modern Japanese people today still carry both Jōmon and Yayoi ancestry. But here's where the mystery begins. Between the 3rd and 6th centuries, during what historians call the Kofun period, something changed again, and for a long time, nobody knew exactly what. This era is famous for its massive burial mounds, some shaped like keyholes, built for powerful elites. Inside were weapons, armor, mirrors, and horse gear. Suddenly, Japan had a ruling class that looked more militarized, more connected to the mainland, and more politically centralized than before. For generations, historians debated, was this just cultural influence, or did new people actually arrive? Ancient DNA has now answered that question. Genetic studies reveal a third major ancestral component entering Japan during this time, distinct from both the Jōmon and the Yayoi. Researchers now call this the Kofun ancestry, sometimes described as the third wave. The warrior elite of early Japan may have descended in part from this third wave, migrants whose arrival reshaped the islands and laid the foundation for the future samurai class. These Kofun-era individuals show genetic ties to populations on the East Asian mainland, particularly regions connected to Korea and northern China. This wasn't just trade, it wasn't just ideas, it was people, families, lineages, elites moving across the sea and embedding themselves in positions of power. And with them came something else that would define the samurai forever: horses. Before these centuries, horses were rare in Japan. Afterward, mounted warfare began to transform the nature of combat. Armor styles changed, weapons changed, military tactics evolved. Mounted archers, armored riders, and clan-based warrior elites began to dominate regional power struggles. Over time, these mounted fighters would evolve into the class we now call samurai. But the horse connection opens an even bigger door. Because mounted warrior culture didn't begin in Japan, it spread across Eurasia, from the great grasslands of the steppe, the same vast belt of territory that once gave rise to nomadic warrior confederations like the Scythians, and centuries later, the Huns. Genetic and cultural signals suggest that the military traditions shaping early samurai elites were part of a wider Eurasian pattern of horse-based warrior societies, linking Japan, indirectly, to the same deep currents that produced the steppe's most feared fighters. This doesn't mean samurai were Huns. It means the technologies, animals, and warrior models that transformed Japan were connected to a much larger world of movement and exchange across Asia. By the Heian period, starting in the late 700s, Japan's imperial court in Kyoto still held symbolic authority, but real power in the provinces depended on armed clans. Families like the Taira and Minamoto built private armies, defended estates, and fought rival groups. These provincial warriors, bound by loyalty and trained in mounted combat, became the backbone of the samurai. And right here, in this turning point of history, is where we have to pause for a second. Because if you're fascinated by how DNA is rewriting the origin stories of the world's most legendary groups, this is exactly what we explore on GenealogyX, the hidden genetic history behind the names you thought you knew. As samurai power expanded, especially during the Kamakura and Muromachi periods, they became a hereditary class. Status was passed through bloodlines. Genealogies were guarded like treasure. Clans claimed descent from noble houses, imperial branches, even divine ancestors. But biology tells a more complex story than family legends. These warrior families didn't live in isolation. They formed alliances, arranged marriages, adopted heirs, and absorbed talented fighters from outside their original lineages. Over generations, their gene pool reflected the broader population shifts already shaping Japan, including the legacy of that Kofun third wave. The samurai were not the frozen descendants of a single ancient tribe. They were the living result of centuries of migration, intermarriage, and elite mixing, their DNA carrying layers of Japan's hidden population history. Even physical anthropology supports this slow blending. Skeletal remains from different periods show gradual shifts in stature and facial structure consistent with increasing mainland East Asian influence layered on top of older Jōmon-derived traits. By the time of the Tokugawa shogunate, when samurai ruled a rigid social order from the 1600s to the 1800s, they were seen as the pure warrior class of Japan. Swords at their sides, top knots marking their status, they stood above farmers, artisans, and merchants. But genetically, they were the heirs of multiple migrations. Jōmon roots, Yayoi farmers, and the later Kofun ancestry tied to elite clans and expanding military culture. The DNA trail reveals that the samurai were not born from isolation, but from ancient globalization, a fusion of island and mainland blood that powered the rise of Japan's most iconic warriors. So, were the samurai Japanese? Culturally, absolutely. They spoke the language, served Japanese lords, followed codes that evolved on Japanese soil, and shaped the nation's history. But if we imagine Japanese as a single, unmixed lineage stretching unchanged into the distant past, the science says otherwise. Japan was built in layers: hunter-gatherers, rice farmers, migrant elites, warrior clans. Each wave left a mark, not by replacing what came before, but by blending with it and rising into new roles. The samurai, symbols of loyalty, discipline, and identity, are proof that nations are not forged from purity, but from mixture. Their armor may have been lacquered in Japanese style, their swords forged in Japanese fire, but the ancestry in their veins connected them to a much wider human story of people crossing seas, bringing horses, new weapons, new genes, and reshaping a civilization. The legend of the samurai doesn't become weaker when we learn this. It becomes bigger. Because now, instead of a closed story of isolation, we see an epic of movement, adaptation, and transformation. A warrior class born from centuries of hidden connections written quietly into their DNA. And that secret, carried for 1,500 years, is only now being fully understood.